In 1943, Britain told America to armour their carrier decks. The Yanks, as usual, ignored this advice. To understand why Britain gave that warning, you need to understand what British sailors had already survived. Because the Royal Navy didn't armour their flight decks out of paranoia or some peculiar British obsession with steel. They armoured them because they had already learned what happens when bombs hit carrier decks. They learned it the hard way, the only way that actually sticks. We need to go back further, to the 1930s, to a series of arguments in the Admiralty that would determine whether British sailors lived or died a decade later. When the Royal Navy's Director of Naval Construction sat down to design the next generation of aircraft carriers in 1936, he faced a problem that American designers simply didn't have. Britain was an island. A small island, surrounded by potential enemies with airbases closer than most Americans drive to work. The Mediterranean was a shooting gallery. The North Sea was within range of German bombers. The English Channel was barely a puddle. A British carrier operating anywhere in European waters would never be more than 20 minutes from enemy airfields. American carriers could operate in the vast Pacific, hundreds of miles from the nearest hostile runway, with hours of warning before an attack could materialize. The distances were measured in days of steaming, not minutes of flight time. An enemy aircraft that wanted to reach an American carrier in the Pacific had to fly across open ocean, had to find the task force, had to have enough fuel to return. The geographic buffer was enormous. British carriers enjoyed no such luxury. The distances were shorter, the enemy airfields were closer. The coordination between German and Italian forces was tighter than anything in the Pacific. Every convoy escort, every Malta run, every operation in the Mediterranean was conducted under the shadow of Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica bases that could scramble bombers before a British lookout finished his cup of tea. That wasn't paranoia, that was geography. So the Admiralty made a decision that every naval aviator in the fleet considered borderline insane. They armoured the flight deck. Not with token protection, not with a gesture towards survivability. They laid down 3 inches of cemented armour plate across the entire flight deck. 120 pounds per square foot of steel, where American carriers had teak planking over light steel. The armour wasn't just thick, it was comprehensive. The flight deck armour extended over the full length of the hangar, creating continuous protection from bow to stern. The hangar below was enclosed by 4.5-inch armoured walls, and 2.5-inch armour bulkheads protected the sides. They called it an armoured box, a citadel of steel wrapped around the aircraft and the men who handled them. Whatever happened topside, however many bombs struck the deck, however intense the fire, the armoured box would contain it, would prevent catastrophic chain reactions, would keep the fires from reaching the magazines and the fuel bunkers and the engineering spaces that kept the ship alive. The trade-off was brutal. Every ton of armour was a ton that couldn't be used for aircraft. The steel weighed down the ship, raised the centre of gravity, limited the volume available for hangars and fuel and ordnance. Where American carriers could fit 90 aircraft below decks, the Illustrious class carried 36, less than half. The aviators did the math and lost their minds. They complained. God, did they complain. Memoranda flew between fleet commands. Pilots wrote angry letters to anyone who would read them. Squadron leaders demanded meetings with admirals, with constructors, with anyone who had influence over carrier design. They wanted more planes. They wanted bigger hangars. They wanted striking power, not floating bunkers. The arguments were not stupid. They made strategic sense if you accepted certain premises about how wars would be fought. Carriers were offensive weapons. They projected power. They won battles by putting planes in the sky, by finding enemy fleets and sinking them before enemy fleets could find you. What good was a carrier that survived if it couldn't put enough planes in the sky to matter? A carrier with 36 aircraft was a carrier with half the strike capacity of its American counterparts. In a fleet action, that deficit might be the difference between victory and defeat. The aviators weren't cowards. They weren't asking for invincible ships so they could avoid danger. They were asking for ships optimized for offense, for aggression, for the kind of carrier warfare that doctrine said would win wars. They believed, genuinely, professionally believed, that the best defense was overwhelming attack. Hit the enemy before he could hit you. Sink his carriers before he could launch his bombers. Win the air battle so completely that no bomb would ever reach your deck. The Admiralty listened to their complaints, nodded politely, acknowledged the validity of their concerns, and kept building armoured carriers anyway. Because the men who designed ships knew something the pilots didn't want to hear, something the pilots couldn't hear because it contradicted everything they believed about their own skill and their own invincibility. Some bombs would always get through. Not might, would. No fighter screen, however skilled, could intercept every attacker. No anti-aircraft battery, however dense, could guarantee perfect protection. Fighter direction was imperfect. The radar operators could miss contacts. The controllers could vector aircraft to the wrong intercept point. The fighters could arrive 30 seconds too late. Weather intervened. Clouds hid attacking aircraft. Rain degraded radar performance. Fog made visual acquisition impossible. Pilots made mistakes. Enemy aircraft got lucky. And when one of them got through, just one, what happened next depended entirely on what that bomb hit when it reached the deck. Wood burned. Steel didn't. It wasn't more complicated than that. The physics were simple. A bomb detonating on a wooden flight deck would blast through the planking, would ignite the wood itself, would send flaming debris into the hangar below, where aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition waited in neat rows. A bomb detonating on an armoured flight deck would crater the steel, would kill whoever was standing at the impact point, would start fires that damage control teams could contain, but would not penetrate to the vital spaces below. The aviators kept complaining. The Admiralty kept building armoured carriers. HMS Illustrious was laid down in April 1937, launched in April 1939, commissioned in May 1940. Her sisters followed, victorious, formidable, indomitable. Each one carried that 3-inch armoured deck that the pilots despised and the constructors insisted upon. And on January 10, 1941, the Mediterranean proved which side of that argument had been right. HMS Illustrious was steaming through the Sicilian Channel that morning, escorting a convoy to Malta as part of Operation Excess. She was the pride of a new generation of British carriers, and also the most hated ship among the pilots who flew from her cramped decks. The mission was critical. Malta needed supplies desperately, and the Mediterranean fleet was running a convoy through waters that the Luftwaffe considered their private hunting ground. The sun was bright, the sky was clear, and the Sicilian coastline was close enough that the officers on Illustrious's bridge could see it without binoculars. Close enough that German reconnaissance aircraft had been shadowing the convoy since dawn. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where Illustrious was. They had been tracking her for hours, feeding position reports back to their bases in Sicily, calculating intercept courses and attack timings. The British knew they were being watched. They could see the German reconnaissance aircraft circling at the edge of visual range, could track them on radar, could do nothing about it, except wait for the attack they knew was coming. The ship's Fulmar fighters were in the air, patrolling overhead in the thin Mediterranean sunlight. But everyone aboard knew the fighters couldn't stop a determined attack. There simply weren't enough of them. The cramped hangar, the one the aviators complained about constantly, meant fewer aircraft, which meant thinner defensive screens, which meant that sooner or later, something would get through. At 12:20 hours, the radar operators hunched over their green glowing screens, picked up something that made their stomachs drop. 40 aircraft inbound from Sicily, closing fast. This wasn't a probing attack. This wasn't a handful of opportunistic bombers trying their luck. This was annihilation. This was a full strike package from Fliegerkorps 10, an elite anti-shipping unit that the Luftwaffe had transferred to Sicily specifically to destroy British carriers. Not to harass them, not to damage them, to destroy them. The German pilots descending on HMS Illustrious that afternoon weren't amateurs flying their first combat mission. They had trained for weeks studying aerial photographs of Illustrious. They had memorized the location of her elevators, her fuel lines, her magazines. They knew exactly where the aircraft were spotted on deck, exactly where the ammunition was stored, exactly where a well-placed bomb could start fires that would gut the ship from the inside out. They had practiced the attack profiles. They had studied the ship's anti-aircraft armament and calculated the approach angles that would minimize their exposure to defensive fire. And they came screaming down out of the sun in Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, their distinctive inverted gull wings cutting through the blue Mediterranean sky, their dive sirens, the infamous Jericho trumpets, wailing at a pitch specifically designed to shatter human courage. If you've never heard a Stuka dive, count yourself lucky. Sailors who survived described it as something between a scream and a howl, a mechanical shriek that seemed to vibrate through the steel of the ship itself. The sound reached the deck before the bombs did. It was psychological warfare delivered at 400 miles per hour, a noise engineered by German scientists to break the nerve of anyone who heard it, to make them duck and cover rather than man their weapons, to create panic even before the bombs struck. The Stukas came down at near vertical angles, presenting the smallest possible target to the anti-aircraft guns, their pilots holding steady through the flak bursts until they reached release altitude. The technique was murderously effective. A near-vertical dive made the aircraft harder to track, harder to hit, harder to stop. The pilots accepted the physical punishment of the dive, the G-forces, the disorientation, the tunnel vision, because it gave them the accuracy they needed to put bombs on target. The 4.5-inch guns on Illustrious fired as fast as their crews could load them. The pom-poms hammered away at the diving aircraft. Shrapnel burst across the sky in black flowers. Men worked their weapons until the barrels glowed red, feeding ammunition, tracking targets, doing everything they could to stop the attack. None of it mattered. In 10 minutes, HMS Illustrious absorbed at least 6 direct bomb hits from coordinated attacks. 6. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a single aircraft slipping through the defences. This was methodical destruction, the kind of punishment that had sunk ships since ships existed. 6 direct hits in 10 minutes would have destroyed any carrier in any navy in the world. 6 direct hits from 1,100-pound bombs delivered by elite pilots against a ship with no hope of manoeuvring clear. This was annihilation by the textbook. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator. The second hit amidships. A sailor stationed at one of the 4.5-inch gun mounts felt the impact as a physical blow that travelled through the deck plating and up through his boots, as if the entire ship had been struck by a giant's hammer. The concussion knocked men off their feet. The noise was beyond noise, a physical presence that filled the skull and made thinking impossible. One 1,100-pound armor-piercing bomb, a weapon specifically designed to defeat deck armor, punched straight through the 3-inch flight deck. The Admiralty had never claimed the armor was impenetrable. They had claimed it would limit damage, contain fires, prevent catastrophic chain reactions. But against a bomb designed specifically to defeat deck protection, the steel could only do so much. The bomb plunged 13 feet down through the ship, tearing through compartments and passageways, and detonated in the captain's day cabin. The explosion turned the cabin into a fireball. Everyone inside died instantly. Shrapnel scythed through the surrounding spaces, killing men who had been standing in doorways, sitting at desks, moving through corridors. The blast wave travelled through the ship's structure, buckling bulkheads, shattering glass, rupturing pipes. Other bombs exploded on the flight deck, killing gun crews where they stood, turning the parked Swordfish and Fulmars into flaming wreckage. Aviation fuel ignited, that high-octane gasoline that every carrier sailor knew was both essential and deadly. Ammunition cooked off, sending shells and bullets flying in random directions. The hangar filled with thick black smoke and the screams of wounded men. The fires spread through the ship's upper works, consuming everything flammable they touched. 126 sailors and airmen died in those 10 minutes. 91 more were wounded, many burned so badly they would die in the coming days. Men with their skin hanging off in sheets. Men who breathed fire into their lungs. Men who would never see home again because they had been standing in the wrong place when a German pilot released his bomb. And HMS Illustrious did not sink. She didn't even stop moving. The armoured hangar box that hated compromise, that weight the aviators despised, trapped the fires, prevented them from spreading uncontrollably into the magazines and fuel bunkers. The armoured flight deck, though cratered and buckled, remained structurally intact. The bombs that penetrated had caused catastrophic local damage, but they hadn't reached the vital spaces. The magazines hadn't exploded, the fuel bunkers hadn't ignited, the engineering plant hadn't failed. Below the armour, in the engine rooms, the boilers and turbines kept running. The men in the engineering spaces heard the explosions, felt the ship shudder, watched their gauges flicker and jump with each impact. But the gauges held steady. The steam pressure remained nominal. The propellers kept turning. Illustrious limped toward Malta at 18 knots, bleeding oil and smoke from a dozen wounds. Her flight deck a cratered ruin, her superstructure scarred and burning. Parked aircraft reduced to twisted metal skeletons. Gun crews dead at their mounts, but alive. Under her own power, moving. She reached Alexandria with 60 tons of fuel still in her bunkers. The plant had never been compromised. The magazines had never been threatened. The ship that took 6 direct hits from an elite German strike force, bombs delivered with precision by pilots who had studied her vulnerabilities for weeks, survived because someone in the Admiralty had decided, years earlier, that armour mattered more than aircraft capacity. The aviators who survived the attack never complained about the armoured deck again. But Illustrious wasn't the only lesson. The Mediterranean kept teaching. In the months that followed, British carriers continued operating in that brutal theatre, absorbing punishments that would have sunk their American counterparts. The Germans and Italians kept attacking. They put bombs on decks, torpedoes in hulls, near misses that buckled plates and shattered systems. British carriers returned to port, repaired, and came back for more. HMS Formidable took bomb hits during the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, damage that would have crippled an unarmoured carrier, but that Formidable shrugged off and continued fighting. HMS Indomitable was attacked repeatedly during Operation Pedestal in August 1942, taking bomb damage that her armoured deck contained while the fires burned themselves out. The pattern was consistent. Bombs hit, fires started, damage control contained the fires, the ship survived. The Royal Navy was writing a manual in blood. A manual about what happens when determined pilots get through your defences. A manual about the difference between a ship that burns and a ship that survives. A manual that every officer in the fleet could read, if they survived long enough to read it. The lessons weren't subtle. The lessons weren't open to interpretation. The lessons were written in damage reports and casualty lists and the testimony of men who had felt bombs hit their ships and lived to describe it. The armoured deck saved ships. The armoured deck saved lives. This wasn't theory. This wasn't speculation. This was fact, proven in combat, validated by experience, purchased with the blood of 126 men from Illustrious alone. The question now was whether the Americans would read what the Mediterranean had taught. Here's where the story gets infuriating. March 4th, 1943. HMS Victorious, Illustrious's sister ship, built to the same armoured box specifications that had saved the flagship, steamed into Pearl Harbor. She was wearing American camouflage paint and operating under the codename USS Robin. It was an extraordinary moment in naval history. American carriers were spread thin across the Pacific after the losses of 1942. The Lexington was gone, sunk at Coral Sea in May. The Yorktown was gone, sunk at Midway in June. The Hornet was gone, sunk at Santa Cruz in October. The Wasp was gone, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in September. Enterprise was the only operational fleet carrier in the Pacific for months. The Grey Ghost, they called her, because she kept getting hit and kept coming back. But she couldn't be everywhere at once. Saratoga was in repair. The new Essex-class carriers were still working up, still training their air groups, not yet ready for combat. The US Navy was desperate for flight decks, any flight decks, and the Royal Navy had agreed to loan one of their precious armoured carriers to fill the gap. It was an act of extraordinary alliance cooperation. Britain sending one of her most capable ships across the world to operate under American tactical control, to fill a gap in American capabilities. For the next several months, HMS Victorious operated alongside American forces in the Pacific. American pilots flew from her deck. American officers walked her passageways. American mechanics worked in her hangars. American sailors lived aboard her, ate her food, learned her systems, observed her operations. What followed was the most direct technology transfer of the war. American engineering officers conducted detailed inspections of Victorious. They measured her armour plate. They examined her fire suppression systems. They studied her damage control procedures. They documented everything they saw, filling notebooks with observations, taking photographs, asking questions. The British officers answered honestly, holding nothing back. This was an ally. This was a partner in the fight against Japan. The British had learned things in the Mediterranean that the Americans needed to know. The American officers touched the flight deck armour, ran their hands along the 3-inch steel plates, knocked on them with their knuckles as if testing whether the steel was real. They walked the armoured hangar, noting how the 4.5-inch side armour enclosed the space like a steel coffin. They examined the armoured bulkheads that sealed the hangar at each end. They measured, calculated, compared. and several of them actually laughed. When US Navy pilots descended into the hangar deck of Victorious for the first time, the space seemed almost claustrophobic compared to what they were used to. American hangars were cathedral-like expanses where aircraft could be shuffled, maintained, and armed with room to spare. The British hangar felt cramped, constrained, every square foot accounted for. One American pilot, examining the arrangement, was heard to comment that the Brits must love their planes so much they wanted to sleep next to them. The British flight deck officer, who overheard this remark, responded dryly that the Brits loved their pilots even more, which was why they built ships that wouldn't burn them alive. The tension simmered beneath the surface of every wardroom conversation. American officers saw the armoured deck as a curiosity, an over-engineered solution to a problem that good tactics could solve. They saw the limited aircraft capacity, 36 aircraft instead of 90, and shook their heads with a mixture of bewilderment and condescension. They saw the cramped hangars, the complicated aircraft handling procedures, the slower sortie rates. They saw all the disadvantages of the armoured design. What they didn't see, or chose not to see, was what that armour had already done in the Mediterranean. British officers explained at every opportunity what their dead shipmates had taught them. Some bombs will always get through. No combat air patrol, however skilled, no anti-aircraft battery, however dense, can stop every attacker. Fighter direction was imperfect, radar failed, weather intervened, luck ran out. The question isn't whether your deck gets hit. The question is what happens when it does. They described the attack on Illustrious: 40 aircraft, 6 direct hits, 10 minutes of hell, 126 dead, ship operational, under her own power, damage contained. They described subsequent attacks, subsequent hits, subsequent survivals. They presented the evidence, not theory, not speculation, but documented combat results. The Americans listened. They took notes. They asked intelligent questions. And then they said no. The rejection wasn't subtle. It wasn't diplomatic. It was contempt dressed in strategic language. Admiral John H. Towers, chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, led the American response. Towers was a formidable figure, the third person in American history to earn Naval Aviator wings, a man who had devoted his career to building American naval aviation into a war-winning force. He had strong opinions about carrier design, and his opinions had not changed because some British officers had shown him their armoured hangar. Towers and his faction looked at Victorious. They looked at her 36 aircraft. They looked at the 90 aircraft on an Essex-class carrier. And they made their argument with mathematical certainty. The British had made a fundamental error in naval philosophy. Carriers were offensive weapons. They won battles by putting planes in the sky, not by absorbing punishment like floating bunkers. Every ton of armour on a flight deck was a ton that could have been used for aviation fuel, for aircraft storage, for the machinery of striking power. The trade-off wasn't complicated. Armour cost capacity. Capacity cost firepower. Firepower cost victories. The numbers were unambiguous. An Essex-class carrier could put 90 aircraft in the sky. An Illustrious-class carrier could put 36. In a fleet action, the American carrier would deliver more than twice the striking power, more bombs on target, more torpedoes in the water, more fighters for combat air patrol. The offensive advantage was overwhelming. The Americans were building carriers to win wars, not to survive them. Wooden decks over thin steel plate. That was the American way. Teak planking that could be easily replaced, easily repaired, easily maintained. Light steel beneath that provided structure without weight. No armour. No steel citadel. no armored box. Because more planes meant more strikes. More strikes meant more Japanese ships on the bottom of the ocean. More Japanese ships on the bottom meant victory. And American Hellcats and Corsairs, the best fighters in the Pacific, would shoot down any Japanese aircraft before it could reach the deck. The British tried to explain what had happened in the Mediterranean. The attacks on Illustrious hadn't been ambushes by a handful of lucky aircraft. The Germans had sent 40 aircraft against a single carrier and put 6 bombs on target despite active fighter defense and heavy anti-aircraft fire. This was what concentrated air attack looked like. If American carriers ever faced similar conditions, waves of attackers accepting losses to guarantee hits on the deck, wooden decks would be death traps. The British had buried 126 men from Illustrious. They had seen what happened when bombs penetrated to the hangar. They were trying to share the knowledge that their dead had paid for. The Americans thanked them for their input. Then they went back to building Essex-class carriers with wooden flight decks, teak planking over light steel that offered roughly the same protection as a particularly sturdy barn door. The thinking was clear, unapologetic, almost arrogant in its confidence. Japanese pilots weren't Luftwaffe elites. The Pacific War would be won by offensive action, not by hiding behind steel plate. American task forces would maintain such overwhelming air superiority that no Japanese aircraft would ever reach an American deck. The Essex class kept rolling off the slipways. CV-9 Essex, commissioned December 1942. CV-10 Yorktown, commissioned April 1943. CV-11 Intrepid, commissioned August 1943. CV-12 Hornet, commissioned November 1943. One after another, the big carriers entered service with their wooden flight decks and their 90 aircraft air groups and their absolute confidence in American air supremacy. That assumption held for nearly 3 years. Through island-hopping campaigns, through carrier raids, through the Great Turkey Shoots, where American pilots annihilated Japanese air power at ratios of 10-1. The Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 saw American fighters shoot down over 300 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. The Japanese naval air arm was being destroyed. The American assumptions seemed vindicated. Then the mathematics changed. By late 1944, the Japanese naval air arm was effectively destroyed. The pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had sunk the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, who had terrorized the Pacific in the war's early years, they were dead. Shot down over the Philippines, over the Marianas, over a dozen islands whose names most Americans had never heard. The Japanese still had aircraft, they still had pilots, but their pilots were barely trained. Boys with 40 hours of flight time, pushed through abbreviated programs, sent up to die against American aces with hundreds of hours of combat experience. In any conventional air battle, they would be slaughtered. And they were being slaughtered, by the hundreds, by the thousands. So the Japanese stopped fighting conventional air battles. The first organized kamikaze attacks came in October 1944 off Leyte Gulf. The concept was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. If your pilots can't win dogfights, don't send them to fight dogfights. Send them to crash into ships. A pilot who knows he's going to die doesn't need to worry about fuel for the return trip. Doesn't need to worry about outmaneuvering enemy fighters. Doesn't need to worry about surviving the mission so he can fly again tomorrow. He just needs to reach the deck. And reaching the deck, it turned out, was easier than anyone had thought. The American combat air patrols were designed to intercept conventional attacks. Aircraft that needed to line up bombing runs, that needed to release their ordnance at a specific altitude and airspeed, that needed to pull out of dives, that needed to return to base. The intercept doctrines assumed rational opponents who wanted to survive. The radar coverage assumed attackers who would approach from altitude, who could be detected at range, who would give the fighters time to scramble. Against pilots who accepted death as the price of hitting their target, the mathematics were different. A kamikaze could dive through anti-aircraft fire that would have forced any sane pilot to abort. A kamikaze could absorb damage that would have sent a conventional aircraft spiraling into the sea. A kamikaze didn't need his engine to still be running when he hit. He just needed to be moving fast enough and pointed in the right direction. A kamikaze could come in at wave-top height, below the radar, invisible, until he popped up for his final dive. A kamikaze could attack from angles that conventional doctrine said were impossible, because conventional doctrine assumed the pilot wanted to survive. The American fighters couldn't stop all of them. Nobody could. Some kamikazes were shot down. Many kamikazes were shot down. But some got through. And when they got through, they found wooden decks. March 19th, 1945, the Pacific, 50 miles off the coast of Japan. USS Franklin, CV-13, a proud Essex-class carrier that had already survived kamikaze damage and been repaired to fight again, was preparing for another strike against the Japanese homeland. She was one of the most experienced ships in the fleet, her crew hardened by months of combat, her air group among the best trained in the Navy. Her flight deck was a controlled chaos of activity, 31 aircraft being armed and fueled for the next mission. Aviation ordnance men loading 500-pound bombs onto wing racks, handling the heavy ordnance with practiced efficiency. Plane handlers swarming between the parked Hellcats and Avengers, positioning aircraft for launch, chaining them down, checking control surfaces. Pilots walking their pre-flight inspections, climbing into cockpits, testing instruments. The air smelled of high-octane aviation gasoline. That particular acrid sweetness that every carrier sailor knew meant both power and danger. The smell was everywhere on a carrier flight deck during launch preparations. Unavoidable, inescapable, the price of putting aircraft in the sky. The weather was overcast. Low clouds hung over the task force, limiting visibility, creating pockets where aircraft could hide. Perfect conditions for what happened next. A single Japanese dive bomber slipped through the combat air patrol undetected. Not a kamikaze, this was a conventional attack. But the distinction would prove meaningless, because what the Japanese pilot found when he looked down at Franklin's flight deck was the perfect target. Dozens of aircraft packed together, their wings nearly touching, their fuel tanks full, their bomb racks loaded, their pilots nowhere to be seen. A single bomb, well placed, could set off a chain reaction that would destroy the ship. The pilot used the cloud cover like a door, appearing out of the grey ceiling above the task force when it was already too late to intercept. The combat air patrol was looking the wrong direction. The radar had lost him in the ground clutter. The anti-aircraft guns didn't have time to track. He aimed for Franklin's packed flight deck and released 2 550-pound bombs before anyone aboard knew he was there. The first bomb struck the flight deck and detonated among the parked aircraft. The wooden planking, that beloved teak that American designers had chosen over British steel, offered no more resistance than cardboard. The bomb blasted through the deck, and the explosion ignited the high-octane fuel in the aircraft tanks. Suddenly, the flight deck was a lake of burning gasoline. Men who had been standing upright were thrown across the deck. Men who had been loading bombs were torn apart by shrapnel. The fire spread with a speed that defied comprehension, racing across the fuel-soaked wood like something alive and hungry. Aircraft that had been intact one second were burning wrecks the next. Fuel tanks ruptured, adding their contents to the conflagration. The flames jumped from aircraft to aircraft, feeding on the gasoline, on the hydraulic fluid, on the rubber tires, on everything that would burn. The second bomb punched straight through the compromised flight deck and exploded in the hangar below, where more aircraft loaded with fuel and munitions were waiting in neat rows. What happened next wasn't a fire. It was a chain reaction. Armed aircraft cooked off, their bombs and rockets detonating in place. The 500-pound bombs that ordnancemen had been loading onto wing racks exploded where they sat. The rockets and ammunition intended for strafing runs ignited. Aviation fuel lines ruptured and added fresh fuel to the Inferno. Ready ammunition magazines reached flashpoint. The hangar became an oven, then a furnace, then something beyond furnace. Temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to turn human beings to ash. The flight deck collapsed in sections. Weakened by the fire, compromised by the explosions, the wooden planking gave way and sent flaming wreckage cascading into the hangar below, which only fed more oxygen to the fire. For 10 hours, USS Franklin burned. The fire was so intense that rescue ships couldn't approach. The heat drove them back. The explosions made close approach suicidal. Destroyers circled at a safe distance, watching helplessly as Franklin burned, picking up survivors from the water when they could, unable to do anything about the inferno consuming the carrier. Sailors trapped on the burning deck had to choose between the flames and the sea. Many chose the sea, only to find themselves swimming through water covered with burning fuel. The aviation gasoline had spilled over the sides, coating the ocean's surface, turning the water itself into a death trap. Men who escaped the fire on deck found fire in the water. Some drowned, some burned, some did both. The damage control teams fought with everything they had. They fought with hoses and foam and sheer desperate courage. They entered compartments so hot that their clothing smoked. They dragged wounded shipmates through passageways choked with toxic fumes. They kept fighting long after rational calculation said the ship was lost. 807 men died. Let that number sit. 807. 487 more were wounded. Many burned beyond recognition by aviation fuel fires that left them screaming for morphine that couldn't come fast enough. Men whose skin had melted. Men whose lungs were seared. Men who would spend months in hospitals, undergoing surgery after surgery, never fully recovering from what the fire had done to them. The ship was gutted. Her hangar a blackened cavern, the steel framework twisted by heat into grotesque shapes. Her flight deck a warped ruin of charred wood and buckled metal. Her interior spaces charred down to bare steel, where the paint and insulation and everything flammable had burned away. The smell, that particular smell of burned metal and burned fuel and burned human flesh, would haunt every survivor for the rest of their lives. Franklin would be towed to Brooklyn, repaired at a cost exceeding her original construction, and never fight again. 2 bombs, 1 aircraft, 807 dead. And Franklin wasn't even hit by a kamikaze. She was hit by a conventional dive bomber dropping conventional bombs. The wooden deck that American designers had sworn would never see a bomb had seen 2, and the result was a floating crematorium. If conventional bombs could do this, if a single aircraft with 2 bombs could kill 800 men, What would happen when the kamikazes came in force? The Americans were about to find out. Less than 2 months later, May 11th, 1945, USS Bunker Hill, another Essex-class carrier, another wooden deck, another ship packed with aircraft, was operating off Okinawa when 2 kamikazes found her within 30 seconds of each other. The first kamikaze dove through the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire, absorbing hits that would have destroyed any conventional attacker. Bullets punched through the fuselage, shrapnel tore the wings, the engine caught fire. The pilot held his course as his aircraft disintegrated around him, as flames erupted around his cockpit, as death reached for him. He didn't pull out. He didn't try to escape. He aimed for the flight deck and kept coming. The impact was catastrophic. The kamikaze struck amidst the parked aircraft on Bunker Hill's wooden deck, and the explosion set off exactly the chain reaction that Franklin had demonstrated 2 months earlier. Aviation fuel ignited. Bombs cooked off. Fire spread across the deck with terrifying speed. Men were burning before they knew what had happened. And before the crew could even begin to respond, the second kamikaze hit. This one struck the unarmored flight deck seconds after the first. 2 aircraft, one right after the other, turning the ship into an inferno. The fires from the first hit were now joined by fires from the second, and the 2 conflagrations merged into a single blaze that consumed the ship's upper works. 373 men died on Bunker Hill that morning. 264 more were wounded. The fires burned for hours. The ship was knocked out of the war permanently, sent home for repairs that would take months. 2 kamikazes. 373 dead, a ship out of action when the war needed every carrier it could get. And still the kamikazes kept coming. USS Enterprise, the grey ghost herself, the most decorated ship in the American fleet, survivor of more battles than any carrier in history, was hit twice by kamikazes. She survived, but barely. The damage control efforts were heroic. The ship kept fighting. But the cost was measured in dead sailors and months of repair. USS Hancock, hit by kamikaze, 72 dead. USS Intrepid, hit by kamikazes multiple times, 51 dead in one attack alone. USS Saratoga, hit by kamikazes at Iwo Jima, 123 dead. USS Wasp, hit by kamikaze, 101 dead. The list went on and on and on. American carriers with wooden decks, American sailors dying by the hundreds, American ships limping back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for months of repairs. The kamikazes weren't winning the war. By mid-1945, nothing could save Japan. But they were extracting a terrible price for victory. A price measured in burned bodies and shattered families and ships that would never fight again. And the whole time, the British carriers were operating in the same waters, taking the same kamikaze attacks, getting hit by the same suicide aircraft, with completely different results. 6 weeks after Franklin burned, May 4th, 1945. The Pacific sun was high over the fleet anchorage at Okinawa. HMS Formidable, one of those armoured British carriers the Americans had dismissed 2 years earlier, was operating aircraft in support of the invasion. The kamikazes had been coming for weeks. Suicide attacks that accepted the deaths of their pilots as the price of hitting the deck. The British crews knew what was coming. They had heard the reports from American ships. They had seen the columns of smoke on the horizon where American carriers burned. They just didn't know when their turn would come. The kamikaze that found Formidable came in a near vertical dive. The pilot pushed his aircraft down at the flight deck with every intention of dying on impact. The suicide aircraft, loaded with explosives and fuel, struck the armoured flight deck at several hundred miles per hour. The impact was like nothing the crew had ever experienced. The entire ship rang like a bell, a deep metallic tone that sailors felt in their teeth and their bones. Men were knocked off their feet by the concussion. The crash and explosion combined into a single devastating moment of noise and fire and flying debris. 8 men died, caught in the blast zone, killed by the impact or the explosion or the fragments of the suicide aircraft. When the smoke cleared, the damage control teams rushed to assess what had happened. The Kamikaze had struck squarely on the armoured deck. It created a crater 24 feet long and 20 feet wide, pushing the steel down into a depression about 3 inches deep. The fire had been brief and intense, but contained. The armoured deck had held. And then the absurd, beautiful, perfectly British response began. Damage control sailors appeared with buckets of rapid-set cement. Not specialised naval repair compound, not some secret Admiralty formula developed by boffins in a laboratory. Cement. Quick-setting concrete. The same stuff you might use to patch a sidewalk or fill a pothole. They mixed the cement, poured it into the crater, smoothed it over with trowels. Other sailors brought steel plates and welding equipment, covering the cement patch with metal that could handle the impact of landing aircraft. The flight deck officer walked the repair site, checking the surface with the critical eye of a man who needed aircraft to land on this spot within hours. He wasn't checking for battle damage, he was checking for bumps. Anything that might interfere with the tailhooks of landing aircraft. Anything that might cause a plane to bounce or skid. The standards were aviation standards, not damage control standards. Sailors who had just survived a suicide attack were essentially doing construction work in a combat zone, mixing cement while the war continued around them, welding plates while their shipmates swept debris from the deck with ordinary push brooms. The kind of brooms you might find in a warehouse or a school gymnasium. By 1700 hours, 5 o'clock that same afternoon, HMS Formidable was operating aircraft at 24 knots. The cement had set. The plates were welded. The deck was functional. The carrier that had taken a Kamikaze square to the flight deck was back in the fight before dinner. While somewhere in the Pacific, the charred hulk of USS Franklin was being towed toward Brooklyn, her crew still counting bodies, her war over forever. But Formidable wasn't even the most dramatic example. 5 weeks earlier, April 1st, 1945, HMS Indefatigable was operating off Okinawa when a Kamikaze carrying a 550-pound bomb found her flight deck. The aircraft came in fast and steep. The pilot accepted his death as the price of reaching the British deck. The impact killed 14 men instantly. Shrapnel and burning fuel scythed through the flight deck crews. The explosion pushed the armoured steel down into a shallow depression 3 inches deep. Fires broke out and were quickly contained. The armoured box held. 37 minutes later, HMS Indefatigable resumed flight operations. 37 minutes. An American liaison officer was aboard Indefatigable that day, assigned to observe British Pacific Fleet operations. He watched it happen. He watched British sailors emerge with push brooms and begin sweeping debris from the flight deck. He watched damage control teams apply cement patches to the crater, while aircraft handlers prepared to resume operations. He watched aircraft taxi around the still warm impact site. He watched a warship treat a suicide attack like a minor inconvenience. something to be cleaned up and moved past so the business of war could continue. The British sailors didn't seem traumatized, they seemed annoyed. The way you might be annoyed if someone spilled coffee on your desk. Mildly irritated, professionally inconvenienced, but certainly not shattered. There was work to be done. There were aircraft to be recovered. There was a war to be won. The Kamikaze was dead. The ship wasn't. Time to get on with it. That liaison officer sent his report back to the US Navy, and the words he chose would echo through naval history for decades. When a Kamikaze hits a US carrier, it means 6 months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When a Kamikaze hits a limey carrier, it's just a case of sweepers, man your brooms. That was the punchline. That was the final verdict on every argument Admiral Towers and the Bureau of Aeronautics had made. More planes. Offensive action. American fighters will stop every attacker. Japanese pilots aren't dangerous. The assumptions that had seemed so reasonable in 1943 had crashed headlong into the reality of 1945, and the collision was measured in body counts. The Kamikazes didn't care about American fighter doctrine. They accepted death as the price of reaching the deck. And when they reached American decks, they found wood and light steel and fuel-soaked aircraft packed together like kindling. When they reached British decks, they found 3 inches of armour and sailors with brooms. HMS Victorious, the same ship the Americans had inspected in 1943. The same ship they had dismissed as over-armoured and under-gunned, took kamikaze hits in the Pacific. She kept operating. Her armoured deck contained the damage. Her crew patched the craters. She stayed in the fight. The contrast was obscene when you laid out the statistics. HMS Formidable, kamikaze hit May 4th, 1945. 8 dead. Back operating aircraft by 1700. USS Bunker Hill, kamikaze hits May 11th, 1945. 373 dead. Out of the war permanently. HMS Indefatigable, kamikaze hit April 1st, 1945. 14 dead. Back operating aircraft in 37 minutes. USS Franklin, conventional bombs, not even kamikazes, March 19th, 1945. 807 dead. Never fought again. The numbers didn't lie. The numbers couldn't lie. The numbers were written in casualty reports and repair logs and the telegrams that went to American homes all across the country. The British Pacific Fleet finished the war with every single one of its carriers still operational. Battered, patched with cement and welded steel, but operational, fighting in the war. The American carriers finished the war with a casualty list that ran into the thousands. And here's what makes this story something more than just military history, something that still stings. The Americans knew, they had been told. In 1943, British officers had walked American counterparts through the Mediterranean lessons. They had shown them the damage reports from Illustrious, 6 direct hits, 126 dead, ship operational. They had explained exactly what would happen when determined attackers got through the fighter screen. They had said, "Armour the deck. It saves lives. We know because we've buried our friends, and we're trying to save yours." And the Americans said no, not because they lacked the engineering capability. American shipyards were the most productive in human history. They were building Liberty ships in weeks. They were constructing escort carriers at a rate that defied belief. If the Americans had wanted to build armoured carriers, they could have built armoured carriers. They had the steel, they had the skilled workers, they had the dock capacity. Nothing technical prevented them from laying 3 inches of armour plate over their flight decks. They just didn't want to. They looked at the evidence, they heard the warnings, they walked the armoured decks of HMS Victorious with their own feet, and they decided that British sailors were wrong, that Mediterranean combat data didn't apply to the Pacific, that American air supremacy was so overwhelming that no Japanese aircraft would ever reach an American deck. The assumption held until it didn't. And when it didn't, the reckoning came in flames. The Midway-class carriers, designed late in the war after the Kamikaze threat became undeniable, finally incorporated armoured flight decks. The Navy brass had seen enough burning Essex-class carriers to reconsider. The evidence had become impossible to ignore. The casualty reports had piled too high. But by then the decision came too late to save anyone. The Midway class didn't enter service until after Japan surrendered. Hundreds of American sailors were already dead, burned alive on wooden decks that the British had warned them about 2 years earlier. The post-war analysis was quietly devastating. American naval architects studied the damage reports, compared the outcomes, documented the differences. The conclusion was impossible to avoid. The armoured deck worked. The 3 inches of steel that American designers had rejected, that they had mocked, that they had dismissed as over-engineering, had been the difference between ships that survived and ships that burned. The Americans had been wrong, the British had been right. The proof was written in blood. This isn't a story about superior British engineering. British carriers had their own problems. The cramped hangars limited aircraft capacity. That criticism was valid. The maintenance nightmares were real. The armoured box made it harder to move aircraft, harder to service them, harder to achieve the sortie rates that American carriers managed. The trade-offs that American designers complained about were genuine trade-offs. A British armoured carrier couldn't put as many planes in the sky as an American Essex class. That was true in 1943, and it was true in 1945. But the British carriers that operated in the Pacific didn't burn. HMS Victorious took kamikaze hits and kept operating. HMS Formidable took kamikaze hits and kept operating. HMS Indefatigable took kamikaze hits and resumed operations in 37 minutes. The British Pacific Fleet finished the war with every single one of its carriers still operational. The American carriers finished the war with a casualty list that ran into the thousands. Ships that would never fight again. Sailors who would never come home. This is a story about what happens when combat experience gets ignored because it comes from the wrong people. The British buried 126 men from Illustrious in 1941. They learned a lesson in the Mediterranean that cost them blood and grief and months of sleepless nights. And when they tried to share that lesson with their American allies, their friends, their partners, the nation that was building the world's most powerful navy, the Americans looked at the receipt and said, "Thanks, but we know better." The kamikaze pilots of 1945 proved who was right. The men who died on Franklin didn't have to die. Not all of them. An armoured deck wouldn't have saved everyone. Formidable lost 8, Indefatigable lost 14. The armour wasn't magical protection, but it would have contained the fires, prevented the chain reactions, turned a catastrophe into an inconvenience. Sweepers, man your brooms. Instead, 807 families got telegrams. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. The Americans rejected British advice because they believed in offensive power. More planes, more strikes, more aggression. They built carriers optimized for putting aircraft in the sky, for projecting force across the Pacific, for striking the enemy before the enemy could strike them. And then a defensive war came to them. The kamikazes weren't attacking American task forces because they thought they could win air superiority. They had already lost air superiority, comprehensively and permanently. They were accepting certain death to land one blow on the deck. It was pure defensive thinking, sacrificing everything for a single hit, trading a pilot's life for a chance to damage a ship. Against that kind of attack, offensive doctrine was meaningless. What mattered was whether your deck could take the hit. The British, who had been on the receiving end of Luftwaffe attacks for years, understood this instinctively. They had built ships to survive, not just to strike. They had armoured their decks because they knew, from bitter experience in the Mediterranean, from the burning wreckage of Illustrious, from 126 graves, that some bombs would always get through. And when the survival test came, their ships passed. The Americans, who had spent the war projecting power across the Pacific, had built ships to project, not to absorb. They had optimized for offense because offense was what they believed in. And when absorption became the test, their ships burned. You can draw whatever lessons you want from this. Lessons about hubris, about listening to allies, about the difference between theory and combat experience, about the dangers of not invented here syndrome, about the cost of dismissing foreign expertise because it comes with an accent you don't respect. But the simplest lesson is this. The British told the Americans to armour their decks. The Americans said no, and hundreds of American sailors paid for that no with their lives. The receipts are in the casualty reports. You can read them yourself if you don't believe me. They're not classified. They're not hidden. They're just numbers on a page. Numbers that used to be sailors, that used to be someone's son or brother or husband, that used to have names and faces and plans for after the war. The verdict is in the repair times. Franklin, towed to Brooklyn, war over, 807 dead, never fought again. Bunker Hill, towed home, 373 dead, never fought again. Formidable, cement patch, back flying by dinner, 8 dead. Indefatigable, debris swept, 37 minutes, 14 dead. The contrast isn't subtle. The contrast doesn't require interpretation. The contrast is just math. American math versus British math, calculated in bodies and burn times and time out of action. That phrase, sweepers, man your brooms, has become something of a dark joke in naval history circles. You hear it at conferences, you see it in online forums, you find it in the memoirs of sailors who served in the Pacific and understood what it meant. It's a punchline about British understatement, about that particular British ability to treat catastrophe like a minor inconvenience, to keep calm and carry on while the world burns around them. The Americans saw a kamikaze hit and thought apocalypse. The British saw a kamikaze hit and thought deck maintenance. But there's nothing funny about 807 dead on Franklin. Nothing funny about the 373 on Bunker Hill. Nothing funny about the sailors who jumped into burning water and drowned in flaming fuel because their ship's wooden deck had turned into an incinerator. What's absurd, if anything in this story is absurd, is the contrast. British sailors patching their flight deck with cement, while American carriers burned for hours. British flight deck officers checking their repair work with the critical eye of a sidewalk contractor, while American damage control teams fought fires they couldn't contain. British captains resuming operations before dinner, while American captains watched their ships gutted from the inside out. The British didn't survive because they were braver or smarter or more dedicated. American sailors were just as brave, just as dedicated, just as willing to die for their ships. The difference wasn't character. The difference wasn't courage. The difference was steel. 3 inches of steel. The armour that British designers had insisted on in the 1930s. The armour that British aviators had complained about. The armour that American observers had touched with their own hands in 1943 and decided they didn't need. That steel saved hundreds of British lives, and its absence cost hundreds of American lives. The men who died on those wooden decks never got to hear the punchline. In 1943, Britain told America to armour their carrier decks. The Yanks, as usual, ignored this advice. Hundreds died. The receipts are in the records. The proof is in the body count. The verdict was delivered by Kamikaze pilots who didn't care about American fighter doctrine or American confidence or American assumptions about how wars should be fought. The British knew. They tried to tell. The Americans didn't listen. And every family that got a telegram from Franklin or Bunker Hill or Saratoga paid the price for that arrogance. Sweepers, man your brooms. Subscribe for more stories like this.